At WTC, we believe that theological education is important for everyone, not just those in paid ministerial work. As a result, more than half of our student body aren't in paid Christian ministry, but they work in the marketplace, in education, health, the trades, and other venues. But still, in our Christian culture at large, there's a lingering concept of ministry as something confined to the internal workings of the church, which can leave many professionals feeling like their vocation is separate from the work of the kingdom. My guest on this episode, Marijke Hoek, believes that professionals should be viewed as those on kingdom mission in the world and should be supported, equipped, and learned from in their communication of the gospel. Marijke is a writer, speaker, pastor, and guest lecturer in theological colleges. She holds a Master's in Applied Theology and a PhD from Regent's Theological College in the University of Manchester. She co-edited the book Micah's Challenge, The Church's Responsibility to the Global Poor, and Carnival Kingdom. She's a regular contributor on BBC Manchester and a trustee of Ashburnham Christian Trust. In Manchester, she's networked community leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and philanthropists to develop new initiatives. This was such an interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and I hope you can learn from it. Marijke, it's wonderful to have you on the TheoDisc podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So today we're going to have a conversation about professionals and their mission to the world. And maybe looking into a little bit how the potential for professionals to carry the kingdom into the world is maybe misunderstood or undervalued, and the ways that we can maybe become more aware of that as the church and encourage that. So that's where we're going to dig into, and going to love hearing your thoughts on that and your experience of that. But first, before we get there, I'm going to ask you 3 questions that I ask every first-time guest who comes on the podcast, just so we can get to know a little bit about the things that are constants in your life, things that you return to. So the 3 categories I'm going to ask you to think about are a book that you return to, a food or a meal that you return to, and a location. And I should say, I tell all my guests that a book, you can't use the Bible or any variation of the Bible, so that is out of bounds. When I have like biblical scholars on here, they kind of smack the desk when I say that. So okay, so first, a book that you return to.
That's very easy for me because I think it will be the book The Moral Vision of the New Testament by Richard Hayes, which is a fabulous book about where he delves into the New Testament and goes to how do the individual writers of the New Testament, what is their signature? What is their lens? What are the specific of the way they communicate, either the gospel or the letters? And then he says that there can at times be a tension in various aspects of these writings. And so how do we synthesize? How do we help for us to form a lens through which we look upon the word and upon the world? And it's a fabulous, I would say, intelligent, creative way of thinking about the ethical questions of our time through the lens of the various authors, the various voices in the New Testament.
Excellent. Yeah, I've not read a Richard Hayes book that I've not really enjoyed, so that's brilliant. Okay, a food or a meal that you return to?
That is for me salad. I love salads. I'm raised in Holland, and vegetables are really important to us. And so salads are really my favorite food, I would say.
As a Scotsman, that just makes me feel sick with envy.
I can imagine.
We don't really do salad.
No, you would have said fried Mars bars or something like that, wouldn't you?
Well, Marijke, that is sickeningly healthy. Well done, that's great. Okay, and a location or a place that you return to?
Well, I live in Manchester, in the city, but where I go to several times a week is the river. There's a river, the River Mersey, running through the city. And for me, that is just such a gorgeous place to walk. It is safe. I feel safe as a woman walking on my own because there's always other people cycling or jogging or walking their dog. But it's such a sense of well-being when you go to where it's green and there's a river, there's fresh water, there's dogs jumping in. It's children on bikes. It's such a sense of communal well-being as well as the beauty of nature.
It's great. He leads me beside Mersey waters.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Excellent. Now we know you a little bit, so we can get into the stuff that we're gonna talk about today. So this idea of professionals being those who can effectively carry the kingdom into our world. I know that you've done a lot of effective work around in a lot of areas, but one thing I'm interested in that you are intent on seeing is this idea of the church popping up where it isn't expected to, which sounds like quite a kingdom thing, doesn't it? So could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think when Jesus says, you are the light of the world, and the gospel is good news. I think what we at times do as Christians, we hide that light quite effectively under a bushel, whereas we should put it on a stand so that people may see our good deeds and praise our Father in heaven. And one way I think we can do that very effectively is through engagement with the media, so the local media, the regional media, because we as Christians are sitting on a host of good news stories. There is such a creative engagement in various fields, whether it's Christians starting a local skate park for the youth or a poetry collective with the homeless, or there is such a myriad of wonderful stories to be told. And I think we need to be on the forefront, because if we wait for the media to come to us, they would come to us on a very narrow moral agenda. But we are full of life and good news. So that sense of tell those stories publicly to the newspaper, on the radio, in the regional radio, in whatever ways you want to tell it, because it is an expression of that good news, and in a way we communicate through that the kind of God that we are serving, and the story of Jesus Christ as a transformative presence in the way we live our life. So when I think, for example, there's always dominant stories. Hey, and here in Moss Side, it could be the young people dying in our streets, because of the gang shootings. But when you think the street pastors, the Mothers Against Violence, the prayer vigils in the park, the variety of engagement and the annual Peace Week, if you think of the cumulative effect of all those good news stories, what you do with communicating that publicly is you change something in, I would say, the meta-narrative. So we've got hope, we've got a sense of forgiveness. There is an active citizenship, which is part of our discipleship. There is a way of looking, a lens, which is far more redemptive. And so if we do that, we begin to change the dominant narrative with a counter narrative. And I think that's what we need to embrace, because we've got the best story to tell, and we tell it well in our engagement with people, but we need to do that also on a grander scale, as it were, so that we permeate the public debate, because when we do that, we change something in the atmosphere in which all of our mission is taking place. So locally, think of, what is the dominant narrative? Could be a hopelessness because of economic deprivation. So, and where is the church active, and where do you begin to communicate that? Or you may have a whole asylum-seeking congregation in concentration in your city. And how is the church engaging with that? And not just with the people individually or as a group, but what is the salt as well? So when we think of the public debate, we need to place the salt in the public debate, because without that, it goes off. The public debate goes off. And, I'm thinking of the Anglican scholar, John Stott, who introduced this concept of double listening. So we listen to the word and we listen to the world. So we listen to the world to understand the predicament, and then we listen to the word and we think, what has the word's got to say? And he says, if we want to communicate this gospel in a creative, in a relevant way, we need to train ourselves in a double listening. And I think, thirdly, to produce something which is creative based on the word. I'm thinking of an art review I wrote of the Bible Society here, working with a local theatre company. And they had asked the local theatre company to produce a play around something of the Bible. And the theatre company said, well, the Bible, what's got the Bible got to say in our time? And they said, well, why don't you look at the story of Ruth? So they began to make a picture board, a storyboard. And so you've got these elements of bereavement and displacement and harassment and gleaning and a redemptive community, redemptive relationship. So they had these picture boards and that storyline, and they asked then asylum women to walk along that storyboard. And all these women said, that's my story. That's my story. And they produce this play. So they go from a sense of, well, what does the Bible got to say, to us, to delving into a story and seeing how profoundly important that is in one of the most critical phenomena of our time, which is enforced displacement. Yeah. So you can see we need to creatively engage this word with the world and raise questions and an interest and a curiosity of what else has got the Bible to say. What else is that story of Christ? How else does that relate to me in my life, in my locality?
Yeah, I think traditionally as well, we've thought of the church as being kind of a central to the town or the city where people gravitate towards it. And that's obviously not the case anymore. Now we need to be thinking more about how do we now go out into the world. And it'd be interesting to hear, how you see professionals as important people in crossing over some of the boundaries where, it seems like the church doesn't always go or know how to reach.
Yeah, well, just to start off with that issue of the arts. So in a postmodern world, it's often through the imagination rather than through reason. Something of the kingdom breaks through. And I think the arts could be fantastic. I was reading this morning even the story of Peter, when he gets this vision from heaven, the sheet coming down. So Peter knows the word, he knows it, but all of a sudden there's a vision. And it makes him think, it makes him curious. And then, so God is revealing something to him which breaks through the reason, something new. And then in the days that follow, Peter gets those clues of what does that mean? And all of a sudden he gets a wider understanding of what this kingdom gospel is about. And I think through the arts, we can present something of a vision or a mystery or a portrayal of something which is other. And then people can further help people further to work it out in their life, what that means. So I think the arts is very important to cross boundaries. I'm thinking of business. I co-edited a book called Carnival Kingdom, and one of the chapters is about business. And the author delves into a historical story of Norway in the 1700s, where there was no democracy, there was no religious freedom, it was very poor. And you've got this Christian serial entrepreneur, who begins a whole range of 30 businesses, a paper mill, fishing industry, etc. And in the way he changes something economically, he also changes something socially, because the way he treats his staff is equality amongst men and women, and they've got a voice as well. So you've got that whole democratic process, that equality, so there's a social transformation taking place. So I think through business as mission, and that's his whole, sometimes we can go even into countries, we cross borders, whereas we wouldn't get a visa maybe for religious work, but we would get a visa for enterprise.
Right.
And as a Christian entrepreneur, we can then begin to see what is going on in the locality in which I'm placed. And how can I bring something of that kingdom transformation, not just work, not just employment, but a kingdom transformation and something of the gospel into the place where God has called me. So I'm thinking of a wonderful booklet produced by James Featherby, Banking for the Common Good. He's a banker. He knows banking. He knows what's going wrong in banking. And then he thinks, so how in this time, banking, how can we make that once again something, a sphere, which is for the common good, rather than a extraction economy, which serves the wealthy. Economy, there is this wonderful Czech economist, Thomas Slajek, who has went to the Old Testament and the New Testament. So he delves into these Hebrew and first century Christian principles of values and what is the soul of economy. And then he traces how these biblical principles throughout history have influenced the economy. But he then says we need to rediscover that and come to a shalom economy, which people, the planet, we are all thriving. So it's people who know their sphere, they know economy, and then they delve into the word, and then they begin to be inspired once again and inspire others once again. What does the word has to say to our sphere? So this is where I think professionals have got a really important role in crossing into the sectors of society by that combination of knowing their trade and knowing the word and seeing, in our time, it is, I think our imaginations are captured. So how do we free our imaginations again of how can this be different? I think we get our inspiration from the word and then the Spirit blowing over that and saying, what can that mean for our time? When the believers went into Babylon and they felt so displaced, they say, how can we sing the Lord's song in this foreign land? They needed to be reminded of God saying, no, you seek the well-being of the place where it's called. You seek the well-being in economy or in banking or in healthcare. You seek the well-being of the people and you pray for it. And there will be this interlocking. If it prospers, if the community prospers, you also will prosper. So it's that sense of destinies are interwoven, and we are there as the ambassadors of Christ.
Yep. So as you talk about this, is there a certain generation of excitement and the sense of potential in professionals? So why is it then, do you think, that there seems to be often such a disconnect sometimes between the work that professionals do and their relationship with the church?
I think because I think church can become a little planet in its own bubble, isn't it? Where the clergy at times have got very little understanding of what the people do in daily life. They read the Bible through a particular lens, and the examples they will mention are also from their own world, often. So you get this whole disconnect between something of the sacred and the secular. Whereas if you think of, where does our worship take place? It's in our daily life, isn't it? It is on the Sunday, but it is in our daily life. Yeah. And I think that sacred secular divide and that interpretation of the word by a particular narrow, a particular group of people is not always helpful to see the depth and the width and the possibility of the word. So I think that's part of, that I'm thinking of the parable of the talents. With not the parable of talent, parable of the workers in the vineyard. So where the people who come late get a good wage. So what does that parable mean in the eyes of the employer? We need to pay people a living wage. We need to be a generous employer. That's a really wonderful story to envision and a set of values to make you a better employer. But maybe as a clergy, you don't necessarily think of, these applications. So I think it's something of our theology.
Yeah.
And seeing the church as the gathered body rather than the scattered body. in which maybe the minister says, this is my vision and I will lead, rather than sitting down with the individuals and saying, what's your vision? And how can we serve that? So when you're a teacher, what is your vision for your class? And how can we serve that? And the teacher may say, well, I've got 3 asylum kids in my class. I would love a few volunteers to have conversation with them and their mums every week for a couple of hours. Or, there is a vision a teacher has for her profession, for her class. So what is the vision amongst the people of God, and how can we serve that? Yeah. And I think if we do that, we begin to spark possibilities. Because if you tell those stories on a Sunday morning to one another, there may be people think, I can do that. I can be involved in your vision because I've got time or I've got talents. And I think that reminds me of when Elizabeth and Mary meet one another. There's something in Elizabeth, jumps up in her, that fruit of the womb jumps up in her, because they carry something of the times. They carry something of the divine in their time. And when they meet with one another, it sparks. And I have seen that, someone a Christian who led outdoor exploits for young people, telling her story, and then a fashion designer in the congregation saying, but I love designing fashion for the outdoors. So you then get connections I wouldn't have made myself. People of different passions, but they see something in which they can serve one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we sometimes our church models are quite internal looking, or we sense that ministry is to do with things that we do within the church. But since COVID, I think I know this is a well-worn idea, but I think there is still in the air this sense of that there's changes upon us. And sometimes some places we've reacted well to that, and other ways we've gone back to what we know. But I think that there's potential here in what you're talking about with professionals, the entrepreneurial and creative heart and mind, that can maybe teach us something about how we can navigate that change, and this idea of people being kingdom missionaries into the world. So not necessarily just kind of pouring what energy they have into building church structures, but going out. Do you think there's a correlation there between the kind of the need for change and what professionals can bring us?
Absolutely. And I think when we do that, we will sense it's a bit like an appreciative inquiry. What have we got? We've got so much. We've got people who are out in the world. It could be, in their professions or in their community, and they have got something in which their daily life is taking place. And when you think of Paul, who says in Romans, don't be conformed, to this age, but be transformed in your mind to discover what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. That renewing of the mind is based on the word and spirit and life. And then we see that our worship takes place in the sanctuary, which is his world. And so if we are curious to one another, what is your world like from Monday till Friday? Well, what is the one thing which would really help you? Or what is the thing we can pray for you at this moment in time, and expect the inbreaking presence of the kingdom to come? And so we come behind one another in what our world is like, in which our worship takes place Monday to Friday. That is a wonderful way to see this community of the people of God being energized and being informed and becoming more intelligent about the mission that is taking place in our everyday, and the way we can support one another. Mm-hmm. A good theology is a part of that.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier about how you talked about telling the story of the church out in the culture and in the marketplace. I think there's also an inverse in that's important, which is telling the story of the kingdom within the church. Yes. So how has God been at work in the world this week outside of our gathering?
Yeah. I love a book which is written by Bishop Graham Cray. It's called Disciples and Citizens. And in it he says Jesus was a storyteller. So he told parables. And he told parables in such a way that he began with the things people knew, and then he began to subvert it. He brought it to an end which they didn't expect. And he says there is as much power in the telling of the story as in the healing of the sick. Which is interesting. There's as much power in the telling of the story as in the healing of the sick. And then it says we need to find, once again, these imaginative retelling, subverting of our nation's story by telling the story of Christ. And I think that's such a wonderful, wonderful tell your story. Yeah. And reimagine and subvert something of our nation's story or the story of our time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I want to pick up on something that you touched on there, but you spoke about how theological training is really important. Theological education often regarded as the domain of the clergy, of ministers, or people who are training for ordination or for ministry. So why would theological training or education be important for someone who was a banker or worked in the NHS or was an artist? What difference would that make to their mission?
I think, first of all, it's a huge privilege to take time out to ponder and to think and to delve and to have questions which you can say aloud. That's a real important part of, if we don't want to be conformed to the pressures of our time, we don't want to be renewed in our mind. I think to take time out is quite precious, actually. And then to see once again what is the riches of the word when I think of my profession, when I think of my vocation, and how can it further shape me as not just as a professional, but as the kind of professional I want to be. Mm-hmm. And also in the sphere I work, what could be my influence, or when I work with others in a network, what could be our potential influence? And I think it takes time, and it takes the unpacking of something of the kingdom, and thinking about how do I apply that. It's the hermeneutics, isn't it? When I was a master's student, one of the directors of a Christian sports charity, he was my fellow student, and every paper he did, whether it was Pauline pneumatology or whether it was another aspect, he did his paper in the realm of his sphere, of his profession. And it was a fabulous, tailor-made, in a way, journey for him, which no doubt he would have, delved into time and again when he would, develop the ministry and see how the ministry could be a missionary agent for our time. And I think that's the same for a medic. One of my friends is a medic, and he sees how the inequalities in our social layers and life circumstances, how that affects our health, and then begins to think of, so what in my NHS clinical commission, what can I do to systemically also, and who can I draw in to bring a systemic change? So did you go away from the individual patient, but also look to what are the systemic hindrances for flourishing? So when I seek the well-being for my community, what does that mean?
Yeah. Okay, so I think I want to kind of finish here on this idea of how can churches then perhaps adapt and begin to think about investing in professionals. Obviously, theological education is one way that churches could consider that. But what are that and other ways that you think churches could invest to support professional mission into the world?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with asking people, so what is your world like? What is your vision? And what do you encounter? And how can we serve that? So I'm thinking of a plumber here in Burnley. He goes into people's houses and meets people, elderly people, who haven't had hot water or heating for 2 years because their boiler is broken down and they can't, the prices they have quoted. And he goes in and installs a free boiler. and then he looks into their fridge and he sees there's no food. So it's not just, will I be a plumber or a medic or whatever, but what kind of plumber will I be? So if this man who comes into the physical life space of people sees the deprivation and sees what this cost of living crisis means for the most vulnerable amongst us, that could be the poor or people living with disabilities, and then he begins to give, to freely give. And he does that out of the goodness of his heart, but it also needs to be resourced. But the openings it then gives, because you've met people at their point of need, and the openings it then gives to minister, not just a free boiler, but to minister the generosity and the concern and the heart of God. So I think it's understanding the life world in which we function, and then to see, well, we are a very resourceful community, not only with our time, with our gifting, with our money, but also with maybe setting up a page, or a crowdfunding page, or just IT skills amongst us. You may be a plumber, but you may not be an IT, but there's gifts amongst us, isn't it? So we begin to serve one another with the gifting that we have. And I think that's where the body of Christ is the most powerful, isn't it? When you get that, two are better than one, and a threefold cord, isn't it? It's, there was this man without a brother or a son, it says in Ecclesiastics, but then, they come together, and then Christ is woven into that. So all of a sudden, two can have a certain element of effectivity, or one, but three, with Christ, we can do so much more. So when we begin to serve one another with the gifting that we have, it becomes a very rich way of ministering in our day-to-dayness.
Yeah. Amazing. I just wondered if, just as the last thing in our conversation, time is overtaking us, but there hopefully will be people who are listening to this podcast right now who are professionals, who are out in the world. And I just wonder if we could finish on your word of encouragement to them. What would you say to them if they were here in this conversation with us?
Well, two things really from the Bible. I think, first of all, it says, we have been, the Spirit gives gifts for the common good. So that common good is where you are in your day-to-day. So you have been gifted by the Spirit with gifts for the common good. That's one particular expectation of, expect the Spirit really to help you, to give you ideas, to whisper to you, to signpost you, to make connections for you, to go beyond. In our human weakness, the Spirit is a power, isn't it? It's that twin theme in Paul. There's this human weakness, we are limited, but with the Spirit, you've got this divine twin theme. The Spirit empowers us for these works of service. And secondly, is that we are the ambassadors of Christ. So when you're an ambassador and you go to a foreign land, you are authorized, you are commissioned, you are equipped, you are resourced to represent your king, your queen, or whatever in that foreign land. And so we, as the ambassadors of Christ, we need to have this full realization. I am not just a shop owner because I loved it, but I'm a shop owner because God has placed me there, or I am a speech therapist because God has placed me there. So I am commissioned. I've got some authority. I can expect the resourcing of the kingdom to come to me, to be all that I need to be. And I know that of myself, at my time in which I was a speech therapist, it was a delight, because you've got this one-to-one relationship with someone, and it gives openings beyond what I could have expected. And I think it's that, isn't it, that we expect immeasurably more than just another day at work.
Yeah.
Or, just ourselves with sometimes that powerlessness we feel, how can we change situations? But we are there as the ambassador, empowered by the Spirit, who helps us in our human weakness.
Marijke, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your thoughts, and I'm sure it'll be a real encouragement to those who are listening, who are out in the marketplace working, knowing that they are ambassadors of the kingdom. I appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you Marijke and Kenny for inspiring us to be kingdom missionaries wherever we find ourselves. In our next episode, Kenny will be joined by Aaron White, who teaches the course Jesus and the Prophetic Community at WTC and is also the National Director for 24/7 Prayer in Canada. He has authored and co-authored quite a few books and also co-hosts a podcast called Two Wise Fools, discussing various pop culture narratives and how they affect us. Aaron is a great communicator, and this episode promises to be entertaining. Thank you for listening to episode 25 of Theodisc. Join us for episode 26 with Aaron White as we look at how modern ways of storytelling can help shape our theology and ministry. Bye for now.